For more than 30 years, David Collins worked at the same bank branch. He wasn't a manager. He wasn't an executive. He wasn't even the most senior employee. Yet customers regularly entered the branch asking the same question. Is David here today? Some were opening their first savings account. Others were planning retirement. Some needed advice after losing a loved one. Others simply wanted reassurance before making an important financial decision. Whatever the reason, they often wanted to speak with David Collins. The request puzzled Rachel Morgan. As regional director, she oversaw dozens of branches. She was leading one of the bank's most ambitious modernization programs. Customers could transfer money from their phones, apply for loans online, manage investments from home. From Rachel's perspective, banking was becoming faster, simpler, and more accessible than ever before. So why were customers still asking for David Collins? Why did they continue seeking out one employee in an age of apps, automation, and online services? Before the month was over, Rachel would discover the answer, and it would change the way she thought about banking forever. The branch opened at 9 o'clock. By 9:15, customers were already filling the lobby. Some approached the service desks. Others waited near the appointment offices. The morning settled into the familiar rhythm of a busy bank. David Collins greeted each customer with the same calm professionalism he had carried for decades. At 57 years old, he had spent more than half his life working at the branch. The building had changed. The technology had changed. The banking industry had changed. David remained remarkably the same. Not because he resisted change, because he understood something many people overlooked. People rarely visited a bank because they enjoyed talking about money. Most came because something important was happening in their lives. A new home, or a new business. A retirement, a loss, a dream, a worry. Money was usually only part of the conversation. Shortly after opening, an elderly woman approached David's desk. "Good morning, Mrs. Turner." The woman's face brightened immediately. "Good morning, David." David smiled. "How's your grandson enjoying university?" Mrs. Turner laughed softly. "He spends more time studying than sleeping. Probably a good sign." "I hope so." The exchange lasted less than 20 seconds. Yet when Mrs. Turner sat down, she looked noticeably more relaxed than when she had entered. To most people, it would have seemed insignificant. To David, it mattered. People liked being remembered. A little later, a young couple arrived for an appointment. Neither looked particularly comfortable. David immediately recognized the expression. First mortgage. He had seen it hundreds of times. Excitement, hope, fear. Usually all at once. The young man sat forward nervously. "We've never done anything like this before." David smiled. "That's true for everyone the first time." The couple laughed. The tension eased immediately. For the next 30 minutes, David carefully explained the process, not rushing, not overwhelming them with terminology, making sure they understood every step. When the meeting ended, the couple shook his hand. As they walked toward the exit, Rachel Morgan happened to pass through the lobby. She noticed the smiles. Not unusual. What caught her attention was something else. The young woman turned back toward David. "Thank you," David nodded politely. Then the young woman added, "You made this feel a lot less scary." Rachel paused briefly, then continued walking. Interesting. Very interesting. Later that afternoon, Rachel reviewed the branch's customer feedback reports. Most comments focused on service quality, efficiency, professionalism. Then she noticed something. The same name appeared repeatedly. David Collins. Again, and again, and again. Rachel leaned back in her chair. The branch's numbers were good. Very good. Digital adoption rates were rising. Online services were growing. Customers were increasingly managing their finances without visiting a branch at all. Exactly as planned. Yet somehow, one employee continued attracting extraordinary loyalty. Not because of technology, not because of marketing. People simply trusted him. And Rachel wanted to know why. The answer, she suspected, had something to do with banking. She would soon discover it had much more to do with people. Rachel Morgan arrived at the branch on Monday morning, carrying a folder marked Regional Transformation Initiative. For the past 18 months, the bank had invested heavily in digital services. Customers could transfer money online, apply for loans through mobile applications, schedule appointments without speaking to an employee. The results had been impressive. Operating costs were falling. Customer adoption was rising. Branch traffic was steadily decreasing. From a business perspective, the strategy was working. Which led to the next question. How many in-person advisors were still necessary? That question had brought Rachel to David Collins' branch. Over the coming week, she would review staffing levels across the region. The objective was straightforward. Identify opportunities to modernize. Reduce unnecessary costs. Allocate resources more efficiently. Nothing unusual. Nothing controversial. At least in theory. Rachel settled again into the small office overlooking the branch floor, opened her reports, and began reviewing performance metrics. The numbers were excellent. Customer retention, loan performance, new accounts, investment growth. One figure stood out: customer loyalty. The branch consistently outperformed nearly every other location in the region. Rachel studied the report twice, then a third time. This branch processed fewer appointments than several larger locations. Its staff spent more time with customers. Its advisors handled fewer meetings per day, yet customer retention remained exceptional. Something wasn't fitting the model. Shortly after lunch, an elderly woman entered the branch carrying a worn leather folder. She was dressed simply. Nothing about her attracted attention. David looked up immediately. "Good afternoon, Margaret." The woman's face brightened. "Hello, David." Rachel noticed something unusual. Not the greeting. The familiarity. The ease. Many customers appeared comfortable around David Collins. Margaret appeared completely at home, as though she had been walking through those doors for years, perhaps decades. David led her to a private meeting room. The meeting lasted nearly an hour. Rachel frowned slightly. The branch's new advisory guidelines encouraged shorter appointments whenever possible. When Margaret finally emerged, she stopped. "Thank you." David smiled. "Happy to help." Margaret shook her head. No. For a moment she searched for the right words. Thank you for always taking the time. Then she left. Rachel watched her walk out of the branch. The sentence stayed with her. Thank you for always taking the time. Because time was exactly what the transformation project was trying to reduce. And for the first time, Rachel wondered whether something valuable might be disappearing along with it. That afternoon, Rachel walked through the branch, observing, listening. Her attention repeatedly returned to David Collins. Not because he appeared particularly efficient. In fact, the opposite seemed true. One meeting lasted nearly an hour. Another stretched past 40 minutes. A third customer stopped simply to ask a question and remained for 20 minutes. Rachel made several notes. Not critical notes. Professional observations. Yet one question appeared repeatedly. Why? 2 days later, she attended a regional planning call. A senior executive reviewed upcoming recommendations. Branches with declining traffic should consider reducing advisory positions. Rachel nodded. That was exactly what the data suggested. Then she looked through the glass wall toward the banking floor. David was speaking with an elderly customer. Neither appeared to be discussing a transaction. They were talking. The customer laughed. David laughed. Then they returned to business. The interaction lasted only a moment. Yet Rachel found herself writing something unusual in her notebook. Not a statistic. A question. What if the numbers aren't telling the whole story? For the first time since joining the project, Rachel wondered whether something important might be missing from the analysis. And over the next few days, that question would become impossible to ignore. By the middle of the second week, Rachel Morgan had filled nearly half a notebook with observations. Some confirmed her beliefs. Others challenged them. The branch continued performing well. Customers increasingly used digital services. Mobile transactions were growing every month. The numbers were exactly what Rachel hoped to see. Yet David Collins remained the exception she couldn't explain. 2 days later, Margaret Sterling returned once again. The worn leather folder rested beneath her arm. As always, David greeted her by name. As always, she seemed immediately at ease. This time Rachel watched more carefully, not because she was interested in Margaret, because she was interested in David. The three sat together in one of the branch's small meeting rooms. Documents lay neatly arranged on the table. Investment summaries, account reports, charitable fund statements. For nearly 40 minutes they reviewed financial information. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. As the meeting was drawing to a close, Margaret smiled and turned to Rachel. You know, my husband always handled these meetings. Together with David. David nodded. I remember. For a moment Margaret looked down at the documents in front of her. When he passed away, I thought I'd have to learn everything at once. The sentence carried more weight than Margaret probably realized. Margaret laughed softly. Some days I came in with the same questions 3 times. David smiled. It wasn't always 3 times. It felt like 3. The room laughed. Then Margaret became serious again. You never made me feel embarrassed for asking. Silence. Not uncomfortable. Thoughtful. Margaret continued. You explained things until I understood them. She glanced toward Rachel. And when you're dealing with something important, that's worth more than people realize. For several moments nobody spoke. Then Margaret smiled. Most people think trust is built during the big decisions. She closed the folder. I think it's built during all the smaller conversations that happen first. David nodded quietly. Rachel found herself writing another note in her notebook. Not about investments. Not about performance. About trust. Because she was beginning to understand something. People rarely trusted an institution immediately. They trusted people. And over time, that trust extended to the institution itself. When Margaret finally left the branch, Rachel remained silent for several moments, thoughtful, because she suddenly realized that nothing she had just witnessed would ever appear on a spreadsheet. Yet it might be one of the most valuable things the bank possessed. The next morning, Rachel joined David between appointments. "Can I ask you something?" David smiled. "You've been asking me that a lot lately." Rachel laughed. The two shared a smile. Then Rachel became serious. "Why do so many customers insist on meeting in person?" David considered the question. "Some don't." Rachel nodded. "I know." She opened her notebook. "Many transfers happen online now." "Yes." "Most customers check balances on their phones." "Yes." "Many loan applications begin digitally." "That's true too." Rachel looked up. "So why do people still ask for appointments?" David leaned back slightly. "Because they aren't always looking for information." Rachel frowned. "What are they looking for?" David glanced across the branch. A young couple sat waiting for an appointment. Confidence. Rachel followed his gaze. The couple looked nervous, excited, terrified. Probably all three. "The mortgage?" David nodded. "They can read the numbers online. They can calculate payments online. They can compare interest rates online. But they're not buying numbers." He nodded toward the couple. "They're deciding where they'll build their life." The sentence lingered between them. Because Rachel knew he was right. A mortgage was a financial decision, but it was also much more than that. Late in the afternoon, Rachel sat in on another one of David's appointments. A small business owner named Frank had arrived to discuss expansion plans. The conversation began exactly as Rachel expected. Revenue projections, operating costs, cash flow, standard banking topics. Then Frank hesitated. For several moments he simply stared at the documents. Finally, he sighed. "I'm not sure I should do it." David didn't immediately respond. He waited. Rachel noticed that. The silence wasn't accidental. David was giving the man room to think. Finally, Frank continued. "If this goes wrong, I could lose everything I've built." The room became quiet. Rachel suddenly understood something. This wasn't a loan conversation anymore. It was a trust conversation. Frank wasn't asking whether the numbers worked. He was asking whether he should believe in himself. David spoke carefully. "Do you remember your second construction truck?" Frank looked surprised, then laughed. "The old blue one?" David nodded. "You were terrified buying that too." Frank smiled. For several minutes the two discussed decisions made years earlier. Successes, mistakes, lessons learned. Nothing appeared on a spreadsheet. Yet when the meeting ended, Frank looked more confident than when he arrived. As the customer left, Rachel remained seated, thoughtful. Finally, she looked at David. "You barely talked about the loan." David smiled. We talked about the loan. Rachel shook her head. Not really. David laughed softly. No. Then he became serious. The numbers weren't what worried him. Rachel immediately understood. For the first time, she was beginning to see the distinction. Technology could provide information. It could provide calculations. It could provide access. What it could not provide was perspective, or reassurance, or trust. Later that week, Rachel attended another regional planning meeting. Executives discussed efficiency targets, branch consolidation, digital adoption. Then one executive said something that caught her attention. Eventually, customers won't need advisors at all. Several people nodded. Rachel surprised herself, because for the first time, she wasn't entirely convinced. Later that evening, she sat alone in her office, reviewing reports once again. The numbers remained impressive, yet now she noticed something missing. Not an error, an absence. The reports measured transactions. David Collins measured relationships. And for the first time, Rachel began wondering whether the second might be just as valuable as the first. 2 weeks later, regional leaders from across the bank gathered for a transformation review meeting. The agenda was straightforward: digital adoption, branch performance, future staffing recommendations. Rachel sat near the front of the room. A thick folder rested on the table before her. Inside were weeks of observations, reports, recommendations, notes. Prior to the meeting, Rachel had requested permission to bring 2 guests. An unusual request, but not an unreasonable one. For weeks she had been studying reports, performance metrics, and staffing recommendations. Today she wanted the leadership team to hear from people the reports could not fully describe. One of those guests was David Collins. The other was Margaret Sterling. Both had accepted her invitation, though neither seemed entirely comfortable about it. David still believed he was attending primarily to answer questions about customer relationships. Margaret suspected there was more to it than that. Neither realized how important their presence would become before the meeting ended. As the meeting began, executives reviewed charts and performance summaries. Digital transactions continued increasing. Operating costs continued decreasing. Customer use of online services had reached record levels. Several executives smiled. The numbers were impressive. Years of planning had gone into achieving them. Finally, the discussion turned toward branch staffing. One executive stood. As automation continues increasing, we should consider reducing advisory positions in lower traffic locations. Several heads nodded. The proposal was logical, supported by the data. Then another executive asked, "What about the branch you visited last, Rachel?" The question was expected. For weeks she had been reviewing the branch. Many assumed she would recommend reducing advisory resources there as well. After all, the numbers suggested she should. Rachel opened her folder. For a moment she looked down at her notes. Then she closed it again. The room became quiet. "I don't recommend reducing advisory services." Several executives exchanged surprised looks. One of them frowned. "Why not?" Rachel paused. Because 2 weeks earlier she would have agreed with them. 2 weeks earlier she had expected to agree with them. Now she wasn't agreeing any longer. "Because I believe we're measuring the wrong thing." The room became noticeably quieter. Executives love data. What they rarely hear is, "We're measuring the wrong thing." Rachel continued. "We've become very good at measuring transactions." She nodded toward the presentation screen. "Transfers and applications, digital engagement, processing times. But we aren't measuring trust." Silence. Curiosity. Rachel continued. "For 2 weeks, I observed one branch. I watched customers walk through its doors. I watched advisors meet with them. And I watched something happen that never appeared in a single report." Several executives leaned forward. Rachel smiled slightly. People left more confident than when they arrived. "I think their personal visits in the bank are the reason why they still are our customers." The statement sounded almost too simple, yet nobody interrupted, because they understood exactly what she meant. Then Rachel turned toward the two visitors. "Margaret, would you mind joining us?" Several people looked surprised. A woman stood and walked toward the front. Simple clothing, calm demeanor. Many executives didn't recognize her immediately. Then the faces changed. Recognition. Respect. One executive whispered, "Margaret Sterling?" Another sat up straighter. The room suddenly paid very close attention. Margaret smiled politely. For more than 20 years, the Sterling Foundation had funded educational programs, scholarships, community development projects, and charitable initiatives throughout the region. Its assets were substantial, its influence considerable, yet Margaret carried herself exactly as she had in David's office. Without ceremony, without importance. Rachel smiled. "Margaret has banked with us for decades." Margaret nodded. "I have." Rachel continued. "And I'd like to ask a simple question." Margaret smiled. "All right." Rachel leaned slightly forward. "Why have you stayed?" The room became completely silent. Margaret thought for a moment. Then she answered, "Because whenever I needed help understanding something important, I knew there would be someone willing to take the time." Silence. The good kind. The kind that makes people think. Margaret continued. "After my husband passed away, there were years when I doubted every financial decision I made." Several people listened carefully. "I wasn't looking for a bank." She smiled gently. "I was looking for someone I could trust." Many eyes drifted toward Rachel, then toward David Collins. Margaret's voice softened. "The bank held my accounts." A brief pause. "David earned my trust." Rachel smiled. For several moments after Margaret finished speaking, nobody said anything. Not because they disagreed, because there was very little left to add. The room remained thoughtful. Several executives glanced toward their notes. Others looked toward the windows overlooking the city, not searching for answers, reflecting on what they had just heard. Rachel allowed the silence to linger. Then she stood. "For most of my career," she said, "I focused on helping customers access banking services more easily. And I still believe that's important." She nodded toward the presentation screen. "The technology we've built has improved accessibility. It's reduced waiting times. It's made banking more convenient for millions of customers. But convenience isn't the only thing customers need." The room remained quiet. Rachel looked toward Margaret, then toward David. "And over the last 2 weeks, I've been reminded of something our reports don't measure very well. Trust. The word seemed to settle over the room. Rachel continued. Technology can process transactions. She looked around the table. People build trust. No one interrupted, because nobody in the room could honestly argue with the statement. Rachel took a breath. We should continue modernizing. But modernization should strengthen relationships, not replace them. Several people made notes. Others simply listened. Rachel closed her folder. For years we've measured what customers do. Then she glanced toward David. Perhaps it's time we pay more attention to why they stay. Again, nobody spoke immediately. The silence felt different now. Not uncertainty, consideration. Finally, one executive leaned forward. What are you proposing? Rachel had anticipated the question. I'd like to create a relationship excellence initiative. Several eyebrows rose. The title sounded unusual in a room accustomed to discussions about technology and efficiency. Rachel continued. We spend considerable time teaching employees how to manage products. We spend considerable time teaching them how to manage risk. I believe we should also teach them how to build trust. The room remained attentive. Rachel looked toward David. I would like David Collins to help design the program. David blinked. For perhaps the first time that day, he appeared genuinely surprised. David cleared his throat. I think there are probably more qualified people. Rachel smiled. That's exactly why you're qualified. The response drew thoughtful expressions rather than laughter, because everyone understood what she meant. David had spent 30 years doing something many organizations claim to value. He had earned trust. Not through presentations, not through authority, conversation by conversation, year by year, customer by customer. The meeting continued for another hour. The conversation was no longer about reducing advisory services. It was about preserving what made those services valuable. Later that afternoon, David and Margaret rode the elevator down to the lobby together. Neither seemed particularly interested in the significance of the meeting. Margaret smiled. You know, David, I think you may have started something. David shook his head. I think Rachel started it. Margaret considered that, then nodded. Perhaps. The elevator doors opened. The two stepped into the lobby. Customers moved through the branch exactly as they always had. Appointments, questions, decisions, ordinary moments. The kind that rarely appear in annual reports. Yet those moments were often where trust began. And trust, David knew, was still the most valuable thing a bank could offer. Because transactions were what customers did. Trust was why they stayed.